Okay, in Mark 2, Jesus is talking about this incident, and he says, don't you remember what David did? And he talks about the fact that he asked the priest for bread for him and for his men. Now, when we're reading over there in 1 Samuel, we don't read anything about the men, but when Jesus refers back to it, I think we can trust Jesus to get it right, don't you? I think David's men, there were a few men that had come alongside of David. Why? Because Saul was crazy and David was reliable. People, I told you before, David was a very likable guy. Anybody that met David, with the exception of Saul, anybody that met him liked him. Most people did anyway. And so he's got some of these guys who are not happy with the way Saul's been doing things, and they're probably not happy with the fact that Saul put out a contract on David's life. And so these guys are probably waiting somewhere, and they may in fact have been hiding out with David for 3 days while he waited to hear from Jonathan. And so they could have been really hungry. And so the priest says, I don't have any ordinary bread, but there's some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. Now, let me tell you about this consecrated bread. In the Jewish traditions, in the Jewish law, there was bread, they called it the bread of the presence, and it would be baked on the day before the Sabbath, kept warm, and then it was brought out on the Sabbath and placed on a table, and it sat there all week. And then it would be changed for fresh bread the next Sabbath. So what the priest is saying here is, I don't have any regular bread. Now what that tells me is that the priesthood is kind of poor. I don't have anything. I can't give you any bread, David, because I don't have any. Now, why would a man who was the high priest not have any bread? Unless the people of Israel were not supporting the tabernacle in Nob like they had in Shiloh, and like they would later support the temple. And so, now get this picture. We've got bread. How many of you have ever bought bread at the store? And just the other day, I was fixing some lunch for my wife, and I found that she likes this flatbread stuff. And I found a pack that we hadn't even opened, and it's like, hey, honey, we got this. She's, oh, good. So I made her, I opened it up, and the top piece was moldy, and the second piece was moldy, and the third piece had a little bit of mold on it. I found one that didn't have mold on it. This bread had been sitting out for a week. Can you imagine if you have bread? I mean, even if I have bread and I keep it in a bag and I keep it, and I always, whenever I take bread out, I always squeeze the air out and I put that little tie on it real tight so it stays fresh. But after a week, it's not very good anymore. And you know what it'd be like if it were sitting out all week? David's saying, that's fine, we'll take it. He must have been pretty hungry because he gets 5 loaves of the show bread. And so even though it wasn't, he wasn't a priest, he's given this bread. And so the priest in verse 6 gives him the consecrated bread because there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. So it had been sitting out for 7 days. 7-day-old bread. So this is how, so David is getting ready to go, and he's got 5 loaves of what probably was really crunchy bread and really hard. This is the guy that killed Goliath. This is the guy that led Israel in victorious campaigns against the Philistines, and he's given up the 2 people they loved the most, and now he's on the run, and he's eating stale, crusty bread, and he doesn't even have his sword with him. So he says to Ahimelech, well, before we get to Ahimelech, we got to notice there's somebody else who comes into the picture here. A guy named Doeg, the Edomite. Now, the guy's not even an Israelite. He's from Edom, which is down south. Edom is the area that was settled by Esau, the brother of Jacob. It was settled by Esau's descendants. Doeg was one of those descendants. And according to, again, the Jewish traditions, Doeg was the servant who was with Saul when he first met Samuel. Remember when they went on that journey to try and find the donkeys? According to Jewish tradition, that was Doeg. And now we have Doeg here. He's keeping the sheep of Saul. And later we find there is a sword or a shield bearer who is asked by Saul to run him through. And according to tradition, that was also Doeg, Edomite. So he's a guy that, according to tradition, was really interwoven into the life of Saul. And it says that he was detained before the Lord. Now that doesn't mean he was in chains, although he could have been under some kind of custodial agreement. The priests were keeping an eye on him. It's more likely that he had made a vow before God, and he was there honoring that vow. But he was honoring that vow, and he was all ears. He was listening to what happened, and he was looking, and when David came in, he's paying attention. And so David is talking to Ahimelech, and he says, do you have a spear or sword here? See, David had two needs. He needed food, but he needed a weapon too. Because when he ran off, that night when he ran off and he left his wife, and he's been on the run ever since then, hadn't had a chance to get a sword. And so he says, Ahimelech, do you have a sword or a spear? I didn't bring my sword because the king's mission was urgent. Well, he said, the only one I got is the sword of Goliath, the Philistine that you killed. It's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod here. So it was somewhere sitting there in the house of the Lord. And this cloth that it was wrapped in, I found this fascinating. That cloth, the word that's used of cloth is a word that's used of a battle garment. This was wrapped in Goliath's cloak. It was both of them, the cloak and the sword, were mementos. They were reminders of a tremendous victory that God had won in David's life. And can you imagine when David says, there's none like it, give it to me. David's hand closed on that sword, and he felt. Now, I'm guessing that this sword was pretty big. Remember how big Goliath was? I can't see Goliath with a little short, stubby sword. Do you? I mean, he was this impressive warrior, and I think he probably had a sword that made him look good. How David was able to handle it, he was able to handle it. They would kill Goliath with it, cut his head off with it. But when David's hand closed on that sword, can you imagine the flood of memories that came back to him? Because the last time he'd held that sword was the day that he defeated Goliath. The day that he had stepped out on God and he believed God for this great victory, and that the stone had whizzed through the air and caught Goliath in the head, and he had beheaded him. They won this tremendous battle. And then when they come back, that's when the women were singing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And all of that comes rushing back through David. And it encouraged David. And it caused David's faith to be revived to a degree. So David's like, gosh, none like that, give it to me. But David saw Doeg, and he knew that Doeg was going to be trouble. And he knew that his presence there meant a problem. And so David realizes that just so happened that Nob was right on the edge and close to the Philistine territory. And the closest city that was Philistine was Gath. Now, do you know who came from Gath? Anybody? Whose hometown was Gath? Goliath. So get this picture. This is hilarious. David was a smart man when he asked God and listened to God. David, now, and part of this is speculation, part of it is not so much. But it was not uncommon to carry a sword across your back. Okay? Now, I can imagine this sword was probably pretty long, and if David tried to carry it on his side, it might have dragged the ground. Do you remember He-Man? Any of you remember seeing He-Man years ago? The He-Man cartoons? You remember that, don't you? He-Man always had a sword on his back. Okay? And I can just see David, and he's got this sword strapped on his back. And even though some of the commentators said that they felt like Goliath's sword was kind of just an average sword, David doesn't seem to say that. David says, there is none like it. Give it to me. It was a uniquely crafted sword. It was probably very well balanced. It was probably made of the finest materials that the Philistines could get together. And so it was a sword easily distinguished. So now here's David, and David gets this wild idea. Doeg just saw me. Saul's out to kill me. But over there is Gath. It's Philistine territory, and the Philistines terrify Saul. So I am going to go to Gath with Goliath's sword strapped on his back. This was not David's finest moment, believe me. So David goes walking down the town street of Gath with Goliath's sword on his back, or hanging at his side. It was visible, okay? And can you imagine if he walks past the blacksmith's shop where that sword was forged, and some little kid is standing in the doorway, and he's like, "Daddy, come here quick. I just saw a really neat sword. Looks like one you made." And the dad comes to the door, and he looks, and he's like, "That is the sword of Goliath, the champion." And word begins to spread, and pretty soon, David, he's walking down the street of town, and maybe he's got a couple of guys with him, maybe he doesn't, I don't know. But people are beginning to whisper. And the next thing you know, there's these guys in black suits and sunglasses. Oh, no, okay. That's in the movies. But he's got this escort behind him, and all of a sudden somebody grabs his arm, and he's like, what? And I said, "We're going to the king." Now, what happens here is it's either funny or it's sad. One of the two. Because it says that people are saying, "Isn't that David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one that they sing about?" And they say, "Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." David hears them, and it says that he took these words to heart, and he was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So, he pretended to be insane. Now, I encountered something as I was studying today that I'd never come across before. David's at a really low point in his life. He's at the lowest point he has been yet. You know, he got really uplifted because everybody was singing his praises. You know, he killed the giant. He's been successful every time he goes to battle. But now, he's lost the two people he loved the most. He's lost his position. He's on a run for his life. He's hungry. He's eating crusty, crunchy, old, stale bread. And he thinks, "Oh, I'm going to be safe. I'll go down here to the Philistines." And all of a sudden, he realizes, "Oh, I'm in deep, hot water." And it's possible that David may have, and this word insane here in the Hebrew is a word that some have translated epilepsy. And it's possible that this was not put on, that David, at this really low point in his life, David had an epileptic seizure. And that when Achish is looking on, he's like, "Look at this man. He's got epilepsy." And it says here that he had the saliva running down his beard, which is a characteristic of someone having an epileptic seizure. At least one kind of an epileptic seizure. I'll get it out in a minute. And so Achish is like, "Look at this guy. He's insane. Why bring him to me?" Now, that's one possible interpretation of what happened here. Another one is that David thinks to himself, "You know what? I'm in trouble. And if I don't do something fast, it's my head that's going to roll." And so he pretends to be insane. And he's just kind of clawing at the door, and he's making marks on the door, and he's making all kinds of weird noises. Now, one of the things the Jewish Talmud writers said that one of the reasons why Achish responded like he did and was so sensitive to the issue was that his own wife and his daughter were both insane. And that's why he responds so strongly. Am I so short of madmen that you bring me this fellow to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? Now, notice what's going on here. Achish is no dummy. Okay? Now, Achish could be his personal name. It also could be the name of the leader of the Philistines, because in some places he's called the king of Gath here. But the name Achish shows up a lot longer than what he should have been living later on. So some people think that name was just kind of like a title that was given to him. But at any rate, we're going to see Achish again. David is going to come back to Achish again, and Achish is going to take him under his wing. I think that Achish here may have seen through David. I think that he may have figured out what David was doing, and that he realized, things are not so good for David over there in Israel right now. I might be able to get him influenced on my side. I don't know if any of you ever watch any of these spy shows where they try to find somebody who's on the other side, and they want to make them an asset. They want to turn them and use them for their benefit. I think that Achish may have been thinking that right here. And he may have seen through David and realized, you know what? You don't get the sword of Goliath if you're really crazy. He's putting on, but I'm going to let him go. I'm going to invest in this asset because I might be able to get him back. And we're going to take some time later on when we get toward the end of 1 Samuel. And we're going to look at some things that Achish does. Achish, even though he was a heathen king, Achish, I think David sways him toward God, for one thing. And I'll show you why I think that later on. But I also think that he was a good example of a leader. Even though he was a pagan, even though he was ungodly, he understood leadership. And we can learn some things from him. And another thing that you're going to find, David will, as I mentioned, he'll come back to the Philistines. And when he does, he'll come back to Gath. And when he does, David is going to stay in and around that area for about a year. And it's right before he becomes king. But he's going to stay there for about a year. And he is going to have an impact on these heathen Philistines to the point, and you'll hear me say this later on, but to the point that when David steps into the kingship, David's most trusted group of soldiers, aside from his 30 mighty men, aside from those guys, his most trusted group of soldiers is a group of Philistines, believe it or not. You remember hearing about David with the Kerethites and the Pelethites? Any of you remember hearing that? Kerethites? They were David's bodyguard, but they were Philistines. And then toward the end of David's life, you have this guy who comes, Ittai, the Gittite, comes with 600 men to join David. And Gittite is another word for somebody who lives in Gath. And so David has a real influence, and even though we may question some of his methods, God uses it for the good. And so that brings us to the end of chapter 21. David is now officially on the run, going to be living in caves and camping out, but his numbers are going to begin to grow when we get into the chapter for next week. So let's bow our heads. Father, thank you so much for teaching us tonight through your word. We thank you for David. And even though things are going badly, he's still connected with you. And I pray that you will help us, that when things go badly for us, that we'll stay connected to you, and that we'll still be able to worship, we'll still be able to praise you. And I just pray that we would learn from the life of this man, and that we would be each drawn closer to you. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Before you go to bed tonight,